Today, we're taking a deep dive into trauma, part 2. Please listen to part 1, our interview with Rachel Rausch, before listening to this episode. Trauma can have a profound effect on our lives. We don't want anything to hinder our ability to fully serve the Lord in the last third of our lives, when we should be the most fruitful. So, sisters, let's make sure that unhealed trauma is not holding us back.
Welcome to the Jesus People Sisterhood podcast, a place where Christian single women age 50 plus connect. I am your host, Janine Jordan, a Christian confidence coach and leadership mentor in Alberta, Canada.
And I'm your co-host, Ellie McCormick, a Christian longevity coach and mentor in the USA. Being single women over 50, we know what it's like to feel overlooked, to have unrealized dreams, to experience the challenges of singlehood, and to be concerned about what our future will look like. We couldn't find anything online for single Christian women over 50, so we created Jesus People Sisterhood just for you, a place where sisters encourage and empower one another through the last third of life, because you are a treasure trove of wisdom and of exceedingly great value. This is an authentic community, a supportive family, with other women on the same journey where Jesus is the center of it all. Here you will find real talk, real community, and real sisters.
Join us as we discuss building relationships, whole health, and growing spiritually. We'll review helpful books and articles, chat with guest speakers, share success stories, and have some laughs along the way. So grab your favorite beverage and we'll get started. First, what is shared in today's podcast is for informational purposes only. We are not mental health professionals. Please seek a therapist or other medical professional for help in this area. If you're wondering why we haven't had, nor will we have, trigger warnings in our content, here's the explanation. The following quotes are from the article, Trigger Warnings on Social Media Posts, from Psychology Today, Australia. Research consistently shows that trigger warnings are not helpful and might be harmful in various ways. Harm includes a tendency to backfire, increased anxiety, and reinforcement of avoidance behavior. Trigger warnings likely undermine developing emotional resilience, a critical trait in anxiety management. An abundance of research indicates that trigger warnings are not effective in avoiding possibly disturbing content or reducing the level of anxiety experienced when viewing the content. And in light of this evidence, mental health clinicians and academics have been consistent in their disapproval of the use of these warnings. Links to the Psychology Today article, as well as second article on trigger warnings, can be found in the show notes. Let's review what trauma is and some of its causes. Trauma is the emotional response a person has to an event or series of events. The event itself is not the trauma, but the person's emotional experience of the trauma. Some causes of trauma. A person could have trauma from a one-time event, like a car accident or a mugging or being in the middle of an earthquake. Or if a person experiences combat, bullying, abuse, or parental neglect that happens on a repeated basis. Sometimes a person may be traumatized by things we may not expect, like a painful romantic breakup or a humiliating event. Sometimes we may not realize that we are coping with trauma in our life. And in the book, The Body Keeps Score, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk proposes that our body stores trauma even if our mind doesn't remember or doesn't think about the traumatic experience or experiences. And for this reason, some people who talk about their traumatic memories may be re-traumatized without experiencing healing. Talk therapy alone is often not sufficient. Many therapists now treat trauma clients with somatic therapies, and somatic therapies look at connecting the mind and the body.
In one of my trauma-informed courses, they explained acute trauma as an unfinished loop, and I found this explanation really helpful in understanding how trauma happens. So as Rachel Rausch mentioned in her episode, in the last episode, She talked about a gazelle being chased by a lion and the gazelle getting away from the lion, and then it shook itself to release that trauma. And then it ran off and it was okay. And it's the same if you think of a human being's experience. So if you imagine that you're being chased with some guy with a knife and you're running down the street trying to get away from this guy, you are obviously in what could be a traumatic event. You have this fight or flight response and you're running away, right? And so that you're in that trauma loop. Once you get away from this guy and you get home, and then your family surrounds you and they're hugging you and loving on you and you're praying and you're coming back to this place of feeling safe and secure and at peace and calm. And you're just like, when that happens, your body says, I am now safe. Life has gone back to normal. I'm no longer in danger. I can go on with my life. What happens in this trauma loop of why trauma would happen is, let's say you're in that trauma loop, you're running away, you're in the fight or flight response, you're running away from some crazy guy, and maybe you got away from him and you got home, but there was nobody there to hug you or love on you. There was nothing. You shut the door behind you and you're still heaving and breathing, and you never actually feel safe after that event. And that's when trauma occurs. It's the idea that your body never got to say, I'm safe now. And so this loop never closed up. It's like you're still stuck in this trauma loop, and this fight or flight response was never resolved. And that's the explanation of how this trauma happens in your life. That's what later on you're going to experience some kind of trauma related to this experience, because you never actually closed that loop and felt safe.
Right.
And this is helpful going forward if any of us experience a traumatic event, that it's important to close that loop. So part of closing that trauma loop to feel safe is to be cared for by your loved ones. So Vander Kolk talks about helping children heal or prevent trauma by their parents caring for them and making them feel safe. And this is an example of how you can close that trauma loop. I think that the idea of we tend to feel safe when we are surrounded by loved ones who are caring for us, and then we feel that security. So if you experience a traumatic event, the best thing you can do is surround yourself with friends and family who will love on you and make you feel safe. We're also told in that trauma course that many years of research have shown that unless your body says it's over, it's not over, even if the mind says it's over, right? And I experienced a traumatic event that was somehow stored for years before it became evident when I realized I had a phobia. So in my early 40s, I had 3 children. I don't think I had my 4th child yet. And we went to a company picnic. It was a huge event at a park with a pool and water slides and a cookout and all kinds of stuff. And I decided I was going to climb up the stairs to go down the water slides. And they had 2. One was open and one was a long enclosed tube that the water ran through. Got all the way to the top. You had to take whichever slide was open. When I got there, the slide that was open was the enclosed tube, and I couldn't go down. I stood at the top of that thing and I could not make myself go down that tube. I just had this fear. It's like grip with fear, this anxiety, like I could not make myself, and I didn't understand it. And I thought, what's going on here? I've never had this problem in my life. I could always be in enclosed spaces. I'm sure I could have gone down an enclosed water slide before. I was baffled, and it frustrated me. It made me kind of angry with myself. But there was a long line of people behind me. And so eventually I had to just give up because I could not get myself to go down, and I had to go back down the stairs. And then I had to figure out why I had that experience. And eventually I realized it went back years to the birth of my second son. And that event was, I was in labor in the hospital. And even though it went against my birth plan, the doctor decided that my baby had to be born right away, had to be born quickly, whatever his reasons were. And so he had 4 or 5 nurses stand around my bed at the time when you're supposed to push out the baby. And they were all pushing on me because, according to him, the baby had to come out quickly. Well,
Oh.
when they were doing this, I couldn't breathe. So if you imagine 4 or 5 nurses standing around pressing on you, and you're like, it's like you're suffocating. You can't breathe, and they're not stopping. And you have no idea how long it's going to be because they're going to do it until that baby comes out. And you're vulnerable because you're in the middle of labor.
Mm-hmm.
So somehow I imagine I was able to gasp and start saying, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. And they didn't stop. And so I'm reached to where I'm screaming, I can't breathe.
Mm.
And they did stop eventually, I think because I was screaming and we were in a hospital and people could hear it and it was going to make the doctor look bad. But my spouse at the time was in that room and he didn't protect me. He didn't tell them to stop, nothing. So it was all me by myself. Nobody was going to take care of me.
Mm-hmm.
Baby ends up being born, and probably because, I was just happy. It's even the scripture talks about you have a baby and then you forget about all the pain you had in the labor. Took my loved little boy home from the hospital, and then I just forgot about that experience.
Mm.
But I realized that that was a traumatic experience that caused me not to be able to go down that water slide, the enclosed water slide. And that after that water slide experience, that I couldn't go into enclosed spaces, that I couldn't exit immediately,
Wow.
that I had claustrophobia. And the reason I never knew in those years between the time I gave birth to my second son and the time I stood at the top of that water slide was because I had just never encountered an enclosed space that I couldn't exit in that time. I even gave birth to a third son in that period, but it wasn't a traumatic birth like that.
Right.
So that whole experience just proved to me that what Van der Kolk shares in his book about the body keeping score is true, is that at the top of that slide, I had no idea why I couldn't go down that slide. It was not my mind reacting to the traumatic event. It was my body. It was my body somehow remembering where it was trapped and it couldn't stop whatever was happening to it. And so there was a disconnect between my mind and my body. So the body, I believe the body really does keep score, even when our mind doesn't think about it. Our mind is not keeping score. And I wanted to mention that mind-body disconnect. What happens when you experience trauma that you cannot stop from happening, like my situation?
Mm-hmm.
You're in a situation where something traumatic is happening to you, is often what people do. They talk about it with children who experience childhood abuse, but it happens with adults too, is they dissociate.
Mm-hmm.
And dissociation is when you're being abused, you're being hurt, whatever trauma is happening to your body, and you cannot stop it from happening. And so the way you deal with it is your mind goes to some other place. So it disconnects from your body, from what's happening to your body. And that's the way that you are enduring this trauma.
Right.
So referring back to how I was unable to stop those nurses from pushing on me during labor and I felt trapped, somehow there was probably some kind of disconnect there.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe some of our listeners can relate to this and realize how we disassociate and how we end up having this disconnect between our mind and our body. And this affected me years later, so that whenever I was confronted with entering an enclosed space that I couldn't easily exit, I just couldn't enter those spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And that made it so, my family were going on a ride where you were going to be enclosed in some kind of cabin, and go around somewhere. And I couldn't enter it. I would go all the way up to entering it, and I would wait to see if when I got to the doorway, I could enter. And you know what? I think 99 times out of 100 or I couldn't.
Right. Right. Hmm.
So I just had to say bye, y'all, and they all had fun without me.
Right. Yeah.
Most, if not all of us, have experienced some trauma in our lives, as Rachel Rausch expressed in part one. Some of us may be little affected by it, especially long term, but others, we can have continuing symptoms. And we wanted to address the issue of trauma because we can assume it's prevalent among our listeners.
Right.
1 in 4 girls in the US have been sexually abused before their 18th birthday. With that statistic, that means that probably a quarter of our listeners have suffered sexual abuse in childhood. Many Christian women have been divorced due to abuse, including marriage to a sex porn addict. Some years ago, therapists began treating partners of sex addicts for CPTSD, which stands for complex post-traumatic stress disorder, because they saw that their patients exhibited similar symptoms to combat veterans who experienced PTSD. We realize that many of our listeners are divorced due to abuse, including your hosts, and that is one of our motivations for doing these episodes on trauma. Now, we will specifically address CPTSD and abuse in a future episode because I think probably a lot of our listeners have experienced that, have issues with it, that whole topic. But for this episode, we are focusing on trauma in general.
Well, thanks for sharing that with us, Ellie. And let's talk about what are some symptoms of trauma. So now, listeners, if you are willing to take down some information here, you might want to get a pencil, a paper, or bring out your laptop, and you can write down some of the symptoms of trauma here. So, which include denial, confusion, difficulty focusing, anger, anxiety, fear, shame, withdrawing from others, feeling numb, insomnia, fatigue, being easily startled, becoming hypervigilant, maybe possessing an elevated heart rate for a long period of time, and unexplained aches and pains. You can replay that if I went too fast there, but we're going to move on to what are some things you can do to heal from trauma. And again, we turn back to exercise. Exercising for 30 minutes most days can certainly help us heal with the trauma, from trauma. Rhythmic exercise like walking or swimming are good. And focusing on what your body is doing while you exercise. Again, that's connecting your mind and your body and connecting with others. You don't have to talk about the trauma when you go out to social places if you're not feeling that's something that you want to do. But engaging again in social activities and not withdrawing into yourself is certainly a way to start to heal. You can also volunteer and make new friends and engage with old ones. Maybe you have lost ties with some people due to your relationship or something that's happened, some traumatic event. And so you might want to take up that again, or just reach out and find some other people and some new circumstances. And you can ask for support from friends and family if you feel comfortable. And join a support group for trauma survivors. There has to be something in your community. And if you feel like an online support group might be better, I'm sure that they're there for you as well. And you can try some self-regulating techniques for your nervous system, like deep breathing or other stress relief techniques. And again, you can do some research there and find one that works best for you. Taking care of your health by getting plenty of sleep, eating healthy, and reducing the stress as much as you can in your life while you're going through that healing process.
Okay, so how do you know when it's time to seek professional help? The article Emotional and Psychological Trauma by Lawrence Robinson et al. Recommends seeking help if you are experiencing the following. You're having trouble functioning at home or work. You are suffering from severe fear, anxiety, or depression. You're unable to form close, satisfying relationships. You're experiencing terrifying memories, nightmares, or flashbacks. You are avoiding more and more anything that reminds you of the trauma. You are emotionally numb and disconnected from others. You are using alcohol or drugs to feel better. If you are experiencing any of those, we encourage you to find an experienced trauma therapist, preferably a Christian therapist. But the key word there is trauma therapist, because you really want to see someone who has experience with trauma.
And there are some positives to this discussion of trauma. Trauma survivors can experience post-traumatic growth. The article, 7 Reminders to Carry with You on Your Trauma Recovery Journey, by Emily Swaim gives the following examples of post-traumatic growth. Personal strength. You might go on to feel more confident, capable, or assertive than you did before the traumatic event.
That's, I feel that about myself. Yes.
Relating to others. You might find it possible to develop closer bonds with others or grow your support network. 2 Corinthians 1:3-4 says, "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God."
I really relate to that verse. I mean, that was really part of my life right
Great.
after I went through separating from my former spouse. It was an abusive marriage, and I really had a heart for other wives that had gone through that. And that really was a key verse in that I felt like I could comfort others with the comfort I'd received from the Lord.
Yeah. Appreciation of life. You may find it's easier to live without taking the present for granted and treasure everything life has to offer. And I can honestly say that has been my experience, that a deeper appreciation of things that we maybe take for granted. And I think I've come to live more fully in the day and to appreciate things that maybe I hadn't noticed before. And so that was one of my takeaways from having gone through a traumatic event. Several, maybe. So, as Romans 5:3-5 states, "And not only this, but we also exult in our tribulations, knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance, and perseverance proven character, and proven character hope, and hope does not disappoint."
Sisters, we wanted to leave you on a positive note with the knowledge that one can experience post-traumatic growth. There's nothing that the Lord cannot heal. So be encouraged if you're dealing with areas of unhealed trauma in your life. Be sure to reach out and connect and pursue professional help if necessary. Hebrews 12:1 says, "Since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance." So if we are experiencing trauma, if we've had it in our lives, we want to make sure that we do seek healing and we lay aside every encumbrance to our walk and our growth and our service to the Lord. So let's fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith.
Thank you for listening today. Join the JPS Community Facebook group. Please share any thoughts that resonated with you from today's podcast episode in our private Facebook community. Start reaching out to single women and create your local group of Jesus People Sisters. Please let us know about your group to add to our directory by contacting us at support@JesusPeopleSisterhood.com.
Have you had a good experience with a business? They've treated you honestly and helped you at a reasonable price? Please let us know. We would like to start a directory of JPS-friendly businesses to direct other sisters to. Let's care for one another.
That's all we have for today, sisters. Be blessed by Him who is able to protect you from stumbling and to make you stand in the presence of His glory, blameless and with great joy.
Hey, sister, before you go, thank you for listening. If you found value in today's podcast, the best way to say thank you is by leaving a 5-star written review at Apple Podcasts. That raises us in the rankings and helps other sisters find us too. And please tell a friend or post it on your social media. If you're a single Christian woman over 50, this podcast was created specifically for you. The Jesus People Sisterhood is your community to find support and friendship with other sisters who can understand. Be sure to follow us on your podcast app and join our free private Facebook group at Jesus People Sisterhood Community.
Jesus People Sisterhood has also started a private Facebook group for housing and co-living opportunities. You can check that out at Jesus People Sisterhood Senior Housing. You can also find us on Facebook at Jesus People Sisterhood and individually for Janine at riseupcoachingandconsulting.com and for Ellie at samaramountain.com. And ladies, this is the necessary disclaimer. Our podcast content is for informational purposes and does not constitute professional advice from mental health, medical, legal, financial, or other areas. The opinions of the guest do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the host. It is our heart that this podcast will be a blessing to you. Together, let's build a powerful sisterhood with Jesus. Make a friend, add a sister, across the border and around the world.